The blood-red sun cast long shadows across Bryce Parrish's land as he drove his plow deeper into the reluctant soil. His jaw clenched against memories that threatened to surface with each step. In the 3 years since his wife's passing, he'd learned that physical exhaustion was the only remedy for a grief that refused to fade. The year was 1879, and the harsh Colorado territory demanded constant vigilance from those who dared to claim its bounty. Sweat trickled down Bryce's weathered face as he guided his team of horses across the field. At 32, he'd already lived several lifetimes, first as a cavalry soldier, then as a husband, and now as a reclusive farmer whose days blended together in an endless cycle of work and solitude. His modest homestead sat on the outskirts of Promise Creek, a growing settlement that had sprung up along the trade routes to Denver. "Come on, boys," he muttered to the horses, his voice hoarse from disuse. The animals responded to his command, their powerful bodies straining against the weight of the plow. Bryce didn't mind the silence that accompanied his work. In fact, he preferred it. Silence didn't ask questions or offer hollow condolences. As dusk approached, Bryce unhitched his team and led them to the barn. His routine never varied: feed and water the horses, check the chicken coop, eat a simple meal, and fall into dreamless sleep. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, and he found comfort in the predictability. But fate had other plans for Bryce Parrish. The following morning, he spotted the wagon approaching his property from the main road. Visitors were rare and unwelcome. Bryce set down his tools and waited, arms crossed over his chest, as the vehicle drew closer. The driver was a man he recognized from town: Ed Wilson, the general store owner. "Morning, Parrish," Ed called out, bringing the wagon to a stop. "Got someone here I'd like you to meet." Bryce nodded curtly, his eyes shifting to the woman sitting beside Ed. She was dressed in mourning black, though the cut of her dress suggested the garment had been worn for quite some time. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. "This here's Sophia Norton," Ed continued. "Sheriff Jenkins suggested she might take the Miller place, seeing as how it borders your property." The Miller place had been abandoned for nearly a year after old man Miller passed on. It was good land, with a solid cabin and barn, but maintaining it would be challenging work for anyone, especially a woman alone. "Madam," Bryce acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat, "Mr. Parrish." Her voice carried a slight Eastern accent. "I hope my arrival won't cause you any inconvenience." Bryce studied her face. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with clear green eyes that met his gaze directly. There was no hint of the pity he'd grown accustomed to seeing in others' expressions. "The Miller place needs work," he said flatly. "Roof leaks, well might be contaminated, fences are down in spots." "I'm aware of the challenges," Sophia replied, her chin lifting slightly. "I didn't come west expecting an easy life, Mr. Parrish." Something in her tone, determination mixed with a quiet dignity, gave Bryce pause. He'd seen many Easterners arrive with grand dreams only to flee when confronted with the brutal realities of frontier life. "Ed's exaggerating my importance," Bryce said. "Miller Place is half a mile from here. We won't be crossing paths much. Nevertheless, I thought it proper to introduce myself to my nearest neighbor." She offered a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good day, Mr. Parrish." As the wagon continued down the road toward the Miller property, Bryce returned to his work. He told himself the widow Norton's arrival meant nothing to him. His life would continue as it had, in solitude and silence. For 2 weeks, Bryce saw nothing of his new neighbor except for occasional smoke rising from her chimney. He preferred it that way. The spring planting demanded his full attention, and he had no time for social niceties. Then came the storm. The sky darkened ominously in the late afternoon as Bryce hurried to complete his work. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a warning of the deluge to come. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, he glanced toward the Miller place and saw a figure struggling with a panicked horse in the yard. Cursing under his breath, Bryce mounted his own horse and rode toward the neighboring property, the rain now coming down in sheets. By the time he reached Sophia's yard, she was drenched, her skirts heavy with mud as she attempted to calm a frightened mare. "Get inside," Bryce shouted over the howling wind. "I'll handle this." For once, she didn't argue. Sophia relinquished the reins and hurried toward the cabin as Bryce dismounted and took control of the spooked animal. It took several minutes of firm handling before the mare settled enough for him to lead her to the barn. Inside, he found the structure in worse condition than he'd expected. The roof leaked in multiple places and the stalls needed repair, but it would provide adequate shelter until the storm passed. After securing both horses, Bryce made a dash for the cabin. He knocked briefly before entering, water streaming from his hat and coat. Sophia stood by the fireplace, attempting to stoke a struggling fire. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet tendrils around her pale face. "Your barn needs work," he said, removing his dripping hat. "Everything needs work," she replied, a hint of frustration in her voice. "But I'm managing." Bryce looked around the cabin. It was clean but sparse, with minimal furniture and few personal belongings. A stack of books sat on a small table, a luxury in these parts. "Storm might last through the night," he observed. "Fire's not catching properly. Your wood's too green." Without waiting for her response, Bryce examined the woodpile beside the hearth. As he suspected, most of it was recently cut and too damp to burn efficiently. He stepped back outside despite the rain and returned moments later with armfuls of dried wood from the storage shed. "This will burn better," he said, arranging the logs in the fireplace. Within minutes, a proper fire was blazing, casting warm light throughout the small cabin. "Thank you," Sophia said, standing awkwardly in the center of the room. Would you like some coffee?" "It's the least I can offer." Bryce hesitated. The sensible thing would be to decline and return to his own place once the rain let up, but the storm was intensifying, and the thought of riding back through it held little appeal. "Coffee would be fine," he said finally, settling into a chair near the fire. As Sophia busied herself with the preparations, Bryce noticed a framed photograph on a shelf, a man in Union Army uniform standing proudly beside a younger Sophia. "Your husband?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Yes," she replied without turning. "Captain Thomas Norton. He survived the war only to be taken by influenza 3 years ago." Bryce nodded, understanding all too well the cruel irony. "My Elizabeth died in childbirth. The baby, too." The words hung in the air between them, an offering of sorts. Sophia paused in her work, then continued without comment. Some pains were too deep for casual conversation. The coffee was strong and hot, a welcome comfort against the storm raging outside. They drank in companionable silence for a while, the crackling fire and drumming rain filling the void where conversation might have been. "Why here?" Bryce finally asked. "There are easier places for a woman alone." Sophia considered the question, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "After Thomas died, there seemed to be no place for me in Boston. His family had their opinions about what I should do, where I should go, but I wanted." She paused, searching for the right words. "I wanted to build something that was entirely my own." "Farming's hard work," Bryce warned. "Especially in this territory." "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Parrish," she replied with quiet confidence, "and I'm a quick learner." The storm continued well into the night, forcing Bryce to remain until morning. He slept in a chair while Sophia took the small bed behind a partition. At first light, with the storm finally abated, he prepared to leave. "I appreciate your help," Sophia said, standing in the doorway as he checked on the horses. "It was nothing," Bryce replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You should get someone from town to fix that roof." "Wilson might know someone. I can manage the repairs myself," she insisted. "Though I would welcome advice on which of these fields to plant first." Bryce hesitated, then gestured toward the western section. "That soil's better drained. Plant there first." As he mounted his horse to leave, Sophia called after him. "Mr. Parrish." Perhaps you might join me for supper sometime, as a neighborly gesture. Bryce nodded noncommittally before riding away, telling himself he was unlikely to accept the invitation. He had his own work to attend to, his own solitude to maintain, but 3 days later he found himself standing at her door with a small sack of seed potatoes in hand. "Extras," he explained gruffly when she opened the door. "Thought you might use them." Sophia accepted the gift with a genuine smile, the first he'd seen from her. "Won't you come in? I've just made stew." Against his better judgment, Bryce stepped inside. The cabin looked different in daylight, more lived in than before. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table and the smell of fresh bread in the air. "You've been busy," he observed, noting several repairs that had been made since his last visit. "I told you I was a quick learner," she replied, ladling stew into bowls. "I've been watching how other farms are set up, including yours." The admission surprised him. "You've been watching my farm," a slight blush colored her cheeks. "From a distance, your methods seem efficient." They ate together, the conversation gradually becoming less strained. Bryce found himself explaining his crop rotation system, while Sophia shared her plans for raising chickens and perhaps a milk cow. "You'll need better fencing for a cow," he advised. "Coyotes are bold around here." "Then fencing will be my next project," she said determinedly. As spring progressed into summer, Bryce found himself visiting the Miller place, now the Norton farm, with increasing frequency. Sometimes he brought tools or supplies she needed. Other times he came simply to check on her progress. Sophia proved to be as resourceful and hardworking as she'd claimed, tackling each challenge with quiet determination. For her part, Sophia seemed to welcome his visits. She always offered coffee or a meal, and gradually, Bryce found himself lingering longer each time, their conversations extending beyond farming to books she'd read or news from town. One sweltering July afternoon, Bryce arrived to find Sophia struggling to repair a section of fence, her face flushed with exertion, her dress damp with perspiration. "You shouldn't be doing this in this heat," he scolded, taking the hammer from her hand. "The work doesn't wait for cooler weather," she replied stubbornly. "At least rest for a while," Bryce insisted. "I'll finish this section." Reluctantly, Sophia retreated to the shade of a nearby oak tree, watching as Bryce efficiently completed the repair. When he joined her afterward, she offered him a dipper of water from the bucket she'd brought. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you never ask why I don't remarry. Most people consider it the obvious solution for a widow." Bryce shrugged. "Not my business. But you must have wondered." He considered her words. "I figure you have your reasons, same as I have mine." "And what are yours, Mr. Parrish?" she asked quietly. For remaining alone, the directness of her question caught him off guard. No one had dared ask him such a thing in years. "I had my chance at happiness," he said finally. "Didn't work out, some aren't meant for it." "Is that what you believe?" Sophia's green eyes searched his face. "That some people are destined to be alone. It's simpler that way," Bryce replied, uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. "Less chance of disappointment. Less chance of joy as well," she observed gently. Bryce didn't respond, instead rising to his feet and returning to the fence repair. But her words stayed with him long after he'd returned to his own property, echoing in his mind as he worked his fields in the familiar silence. The summer heat intensified, bringing with it the threat of drought. Bryce spent dawn to dusk ensuring his crops received enough water, diverting the creek that ran through his property to irrigate the parched fields. He worried about Sophia's farm, but had little time to check on her progress. When he finally made his way to her property after nearly 2 weeks, he found significant changes. She'd constructed a rudimentary irrigation system similar to his own, though less efficient. A small vegetable garden flourished near the cabin, and the chicken coop he'd helped her build now housed a dozen clucking hens. "You've been busy," he remarked, impressed despite himself. "Necessity is quite the motivator," she replied with a smile, "but I'm glad you've come." I could use your advice on something. She led him to a field where corn struggled to grow in the dry soil. I've tried to water it as much as possible, but the creek barely reaches this far. Bryce examined the situation, considering possibilities. You need a windmill, he concluded. For a pump well, the water table's not too deep here. A windmill, Sophia repeated thoughtfully. Is that something that could be built? It's no small undertaking, Bryce warned. Costs money and takes skill. I have some savings, she said, and as for skill, I was hoping you might help. The request hung between them. Helping with a windmill would mean weeks of work together, far more involvement than the occasional assistance he'd provided thus far. I'll think on it, he said finally, unwilling to commit. But that evening, as Bryce sat alone in his cabin, he found himself sketching plans for a windmill. The project would benefit Sophia's farm immensely, ensuring its survival through future dry seasons. It was the neighborly thing to do, he told himself, nothing more. When he presented the plans to her the next day, Sophia's face lit up with such genuine gratitude that Bryce felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. This is wonderful, she said, studying his drawings. When can we start? First, we need materials, Bryce replied, already making mental calculations. I'll take you to Promise Creek tomorrow. Wilson should have most of what we need. The trip to town was Sophia's first since her arrival. Promise Creek had grown in the years since Bryce had settled nearby, now boasting a hotel, saloon, and several businesses along its dusty main street. As they walked from the general store to the blacksmith, Bryce noticed how people stared at the unusual sight of him in female company. You're causing quite a stir, Sophia observed with amusement. Is it so strange to see you with a companion? Haven't given them much reason to expect it, Bryce admitted. Mr. Parrish, Ed Wilson hailed them from the store's porch. And the widow Norton too, what brings you both to town? Bryce explained their windmill project while Ed nodded approvingly. Fine idea, the storekeeper said. But you know, there's a barn raising at the Peterson place next Saturday. Might be able to get some help with your windmill if you attend. We couldn't impose, Sophia began, but Ed waved away her protest. That's how things work out here, he insisted. Neighbors help neighbors, you two should come. As they drove back to their properties, the wagon loaded with supplies, Sophia seemed thoughtful. Is it true? Do people really help each other that way here? Used to, Bryce replied. Before my time, mostly, communities changed. But it still happens, she pressed. Like the barn raising. Bryce nodded reluctantly. Some traditions hold on. Then perhaps we should go, Sophia suggested. It might be good to meet more neighbors. The idea of attending a social gathering made Bryce uncomfortable, but the practical benefits couldn't be denied. With help, the windmill could be completed in half the time. We'll see, was all he committed to. But by the time Saturday arrived, Bryce found himself driving Sophia to the Peterson farm, both dressed in their Sunday best. The barn raising was already underway when they arrived, with dozens of people working together while children played and women prepared food. Their appearance caused a momentary pause in activity, but soon they were welcomed into the fold, Sophia joining the women at the food tables while Bryce was put to work alongside the men. Never thought I'd see the day, remarked Sheriff Jenkins as they worked side by side. Bryce Parrish at a social gathering and with a lady friend no less. She's a neighbor, Bryce corrected firmly. Nothing more. The sheriff gave him a knowing smile but said nothing further. Throughout the day, Bryce found himself watching Sophia as she moved among the other women. She laughed at something someone said, the sound carrying across the yard to where he worked. It struck him that he'd never heard her laugh before, a melodious sound that seemed to brighten the air around her. When they mentioned their windmill project during the communal meal, several men immediately volunteered to help. We could come next Saturday, offered Ben Taylor, a rancher whose property lay north of Promise Creek. Shouldn't take more than a day with enough hands. Sophia thanked them warmly while Bryce nodded his appreciation, surprised by the willingness of people he barely knew to assist. On the ride home, as twilight painted the prairie in soft hues, Sophia broke their comfortable silence. "Thank you for bringing me today. It was nice to feel part of a community again." "They seem to take to you," Bryce observed, "and you as well," she countered. "Despite your reputation as a recluse." Bryce raised an eyebrow. "Been gossiping about me, have they?" "Only a little," Sophia admitted with a small smile. "Mrs. Peterson thinks you're a fine figure of a man gone to waste in solitude." Her words, not mine. Despite himself, Bryce chuckled a rusty sound he scarcely recognized as his own. "And what do you think, Mrs. Norton?" The question slipped out before he could reconsider it, and he immediately regretted its boldness. But Sophia didn't seem offended. "I think," she said carefully, "that grief changes people in different ways. Some turn outward, seeking company to fill the void. Others turn inward." "And which are you?" Bryce asked. "I was the latter," she replied softly. "Until recently." The implication of her words hung between them for the remainder of the journey. When they reached her cabin, Bryce helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you again," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for everything." Bryce nodded, suddenly unable to find words. He watched her enter the cabin before turning his wagon toward home, his mind churning with unfamiliar emotions. The following Saturday, as promised, 6 men arrived at Sophia's farm to help with the windmill. Under Bryce's direction, they dug the well and began assembling the tower, working with an efficiency born of experience. By sundown, the structure was taking shape against the darkening sky. "We'll finish tomorrow," Ben Taylor declared as they cleaned up. "Should be pumping water by noon." As the men departed, promising to return at first light, Sophia surveyed their progress with undisguised delight. "It's happening faster than I dared hope," she said to Bryce as they stood alone in the yard. "Good men working together can accomplish a lot," he replied, watching her expression in the fading light. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked. "I've prepared enough for both of us." Inside the cabin, Bryce noticed more changes. Curtains now hung at the windows, and a colorful quilt draped across the back of a rocking chair he'd never seen before. The place had transformed from Miller's bare bachelor quarters to a proper home. "You've made it your own," he commented as Sophia served a simple but hearty meal of rabbit stew and biscuits. "It's starting to feel that way," she agreed, "though there's still much to do." As they ate, Bryce found himself talking more than usual, sharing stories of his early days on his property, the challenges and occasional humorous mistakes he'd made. Sophia listened intently, asking questions and offering insights of her own. "You know," she said as they finished their meal, "when I first arrived, Ed Wilson told me you hadn't spoken more than 10 words together in a year, yet here you are, practically chatty." Bryce felt heat rise to his face. "Don't have much reason to talk when I'm alone. And now." Her eyes met his across the table. "Now I have you," he said simply, the words escaping before he could censor them. Sophia's expression softened, a mixture of surprise and something else, something that made Bryce's heart beat faster. But before either could speak further, a crash of thunder shook the cabin, startling them both. "Another storm," Bryce observed, moving to the window. Outside, lightning illuminated ominous clouds rolling in from the west. "I should check on the windmill materials before it hits." They secured the construction site as best they could, covering lumber and tools with tarpaulins as the first raindrops began to fall. By the time they returned to the cabin, they were both soaked through. "You can't ride home in this," Sophia insisted as lightning split the sky. "It's too dangerous." Like their first night together during a storm, Bryce found himself staying at Sophia's cabin, but unlike before, the atmosphere between them had changed. There was an awareness, an unspoken tension that hadn't existed previously. Sophia offered him dry clothes that had belonged to her late husband, a gesture that should have felt strange, but somehow didn't. As she turned to give him privacy to change, Bryce noticed the gentle curve of her neck, the way her damp hair curled against her skin. Later, as they sat before the fire, the storm raging outside, conversation flowed more naturally than ever before. Sophia spoke of her life in Boston, of meeting Thomas at a society ball and knowing immediately he was different from other men she'd met. "He had this way of seeing me, truly seeing me when everyone else looked past," she explained, her eyes distant with memory. "After he died, I felt invisible again." "I see you," Bryce said quietly. Sophia's gaze returned to him, searching his face in the firelight. "Yes," she whispered, "you do." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibilities neither had allowed themselves to consider until now. Then, with deliberate slowness, Sophia rose from her chair and moved to stand before him. "Bryce," she said, using his given name for the first time, "I don't want to be alone anymore." He looked up at her, this woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly and changed everything. Without words, he reached for her hand, drawing her gently onto his lap. Their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with long suppressed need. When they finally parted, breathless, Bryce pressed his forehead against hers. "I've been alone too long," he admitted, "forgotten how to be anything else." "Then we'll remember together," Sophia promised, her fingers tracing the contours of his face. That night, they shared her narrow bed, finding in each other's arms a comfort and passion neither had expected to feel again. As they lay together afterward, listening to the storm gradually subsiding outside, Bryce realized the silence that had been his constant companion for years had been replaced by something infinitely better. The next day, the men returned as promised to complete the windmill. If they noticed the change in Bryce and Sophia's demeanor, the way their hands occasionally brushed, the shared glances and secret smiles, they were kind enough not to comment. By mid-afternoon, the windmill stood complete, its blades catching the breeze and turning steadily. When water first gushed from the pump, a cheer went up from the assembled workers. To Widow Norton's success, Ben Taylor called, raising his hat. "And to neighbors helping neighbors," Sophia added, her hand finding Bryce's among the crowd. After the men departed, Bryce and Sophia stood alone beside the windmill, watching the steady rotation of its blades against the blue sky. "What happens now?" Sophia asked softly. Bryce considered the question, understanding she wasn't referring to the windmill or her farm. "I've been thinking about that," he replied. "Our properties adjoin. Combined, they'd make a substantial operation." "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Parrish?" Sophia asked, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "No, madam," Bryce replied, suddenly serious. "I'm proposing marriage." Sophia's expression softened. "That's rather sudden, isn't it?" "Maybe," he acknowledged. "Or maybe it's been building since the day you arrived. Either way, I know what I want now. You've brought laughter back to these fields, Sophia. I'd like to hear that laughter every day for the rest of my life." Tears shimmered in her green eyes. "I never expected to find love again," she whispered. "Especially not here at the edge of nowhere." "Is that a yes?" Bryce asked, his heart hammering in his chest. In answer, Sophia stood on tiptoe and kissed him, a promise sealed beneath the turning blades of the windmill they'd built together. They were married in Promise Creek's small church 3 weeks later, with what seemed like the entire community in attendance. Ed Wilson served as best man, beaming with satisfaction at the match he'd inadvertently facilitated. "Knew you two would be good for each other," he told Bryce at the reception. "Just needed a little push in the right direction." As summer turned to autumn, Bryce and Sophia combined their households, expanding Bryce's cabin to accommodate their shared life. The Miller now Norton property became an extension of their farm, with the windmill providing water for both sections. Word of their success spread, drawing other settlers to the area. By the following spring, 3 new families had established homesteads nearby, seeking Bryce and Sophia's advice on farming the challenging terrain. "We've become leaders in this community," Sophia observed one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the fields gold. Her hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where their child grew a blessing neither had dared hope for. "Not me," Bryce replied with a smile. "That's all I just work the fields." "No longer in silence, though," she teased, leaning against his shoulder. "No," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "The silence ended the day your laughter found its way here." As if to emphasize his point, Sophia laughed then, that same melodious sound that had first awakened something long dormant in his heart. It drifted across their flourishing fields, a promise fulfilled and a future unfolding beneath the vast Colorado sky.